Miércoles. Muchas gracias por estar con nosotros en esta, una de las últimas sesiones de los diálogos del Bicentenario. Buenas tardes. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Nos encontramos en una de las últimas sesiones de esta interesante serie de diálogos del Bicentenario. Hace 200 años se establecieron formalmente las relaciones diplomáticas entre México y los Estados Unidos y hemos sido invitados por la UNAM Chicago, organizadora de este evento junto con CISAN, para incorporar también a Canadá en un diálogo particularmente interesante, me parece, sobre que tiene que ver con nuestra relación con el medio. Voy a hablar en inglés para beneficio de nuestros colegas, pero estamos, por supuesto, pueden hacer preguntas o comentarios en español y desde luego podremos traducirlos. So, good afternoon and thank you very much for being with us. This is one of the last editions of these dialogues of the bicentennial party. Really, we celebrate the 200 years of interactions, diplomatic, official, formal interactions between the U.S. and Mexico, and we were happily invited by the organizers, CISAN and UNAM Chicago, to bring also into the fore some experience from Canada, some participation from Canada, to talk about something that is particularly relevant as a consequence of these last 200 years. One of the things that happened during the last 200 years in North America was an explosion of urbanization, and that changed in a very dramatic way the landscape and our relation with nature, how we deal with organisms. And I thought, when I was invited to organize a dialogue, that it would be particularly appropriate to talk about the efforts that are being made, basically led by Dr. Magle, Seth Magle from Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago, to have a proper record of the fauna that lives in our cities, that comes to our cities, that has been able to reach even the central parts of the city to promote a better way of coexisting with nature. We must know what nature is doing, how they are responding, how the species are responding to the challenge of buildings and the traffic, etc. And there is a very interesting project that Dr. Colleen Sinclair was also invited to from Alberta and several others to join. So we are going to talk about this project in which we are about to jump in from UNAM in Mexico City. So perhaps the best thing to get an idea of this project will be to ask Dr. Magle to tell us what is this project about, how it evolved, etc., and what is the situation in this moment. So please, Seth, yours is the floor.
Thank you very much, Professor Macias Garcia. Appreciate that, and I'm excited to speak with you all. I apologize that I'm speaking in English. My Spanish is not up to the task, but I will keep working on it, and perhaps one day it will be. Let me see if I can share my screen. All right. Hopefully, people are seeing my presentation now. Yes. Excellent. Well, yeah, so I wanted to speak to you, as Professor Macias Garcia said, about a project that we're leading that is expanding into Mexico and Mexico City very soon, which is the Urban Wildlife Information Network. But to give you a background on that, first I have to tell you a little bit about where I work and why we do the work that we do. I work for the Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago. We are about a little over 150 years old, not quite as old as the diplomatic relationships between Mexico and the United States, but not too bad. And most zoos really spend their time working to study rare and endangered species in highly fragmented or lost habitats. And we do that too at Lincoln Park Zoo, but my research center is different. We study urbanization, we study the rapid expansion of urban areas around the world, and we try to understand what happens to the wildlife when you urbanize an area so quickly. We know that many species are lost, but some species thrive. We're trying to understand why that is. Why can some species adapt to urbanization and others cannot? And really ultimately figure out, are there solutions for those species that struggle with urbanization? Is there a way to create habitat, create green spaces within cities that can help to benefit people and wildlife together? At the zoo, we really have three reasons that we study and care about urban wildlife. The first has to do with conflict. So when people and animals live together in cities, sometimes bad things happen. This can be everything from an animal damaging your property, hitting an animal with your car, to things like an animal attacking your pet or attacking you, or the transmission of a zoonotic disease. We want to understand the ecology of these animals so that we can understand how to reduce these conflicts, how to make them not happen in the first place, how to create the kind of landscapes that can reduce the levels of conflict. A second reason is because we are a zoo. So like most zoos around the world, part of our mission is to connect people to nature. And we believe that you should start connecting people to nature where they live, because that's the kind of nature they are really going to experience, that's going to be in a context of their normal lives. Where they live, where they work, where they play. So we believe you start by teaching people about their own nature before you try to teach them about other nature, maybe far from their home. The third reason is, as I said before, we want to conserve wildlife. We're a zoo. We believe strongly that we want to conserve and protect biodiversity. On a planet that is urbanizing as rapidly as ours, we believe the only way to do that is to make cities part of the solution to that problem and not just part of the problem. And that means thinking about, how do we allow for green spaces? How do we allow for habitat to thrive alongside people? And how do we do that in a way that reduces conflict? So most of my work takes place in Chicago, but as I'll talk to you about a little bit later, we are also expanding to other cities, including Mexico City, hopefully very soon, because this is really a worldwide phenomenon. It's not just something that happens in Chicago or in any other city alone. The backbone of what I've done scientifically is that we've created a system that allows us to study urban wildlife long term. And we have over 100 field stations located in Chicago. That's what these colored dots on this map represent. And that's where we study these different species. And we do it with a lot of different techniques. So we use camera traps to study terrestrial mammals, mammals that can't fly. Also, sometimes we get insects on them, like this cool stick insect that I had on a camera trap once. But we also study using acoustics. We study birds and bats. So we use recording devices to record bird song and to record the ultrasonic calls of bats so that we can understand them as well. We want to understand as many different species as we can because they're all part of an ecology, of course, that fits together. But what I really came here to talk to you about, we started that study in Chicago over a decade ago, actually about 13 years ago. But now we want to expand the scope of it because we want to help protect people and wildlife in cities worldwide, not just in Chicago. We can't do that if we only have data from one city, which is Chicago. So we knew we needed to expand the scope with Chicago really demonstrating, we hope, leadership moving forward. So we created this network called the Urban Wildlife Information Network. Sometimes I say UWIN as kind of that acronym. What UWIN is an alliance of researchers who work in different cities, right now mostly in North America, eventually we hope all around the world, to study urban wildlife using techniques that are identical so that we can compare our data. We can actually pool them together and answer really big questions about wildlife. This idea started, I think, about 6 or 7 years ago, pretty rapidly spread across the Midwest of the United States. We started adding partners more and more quickly across the US and eventually several in Canada, including Professor St. Clair's very cool study that she's going to tell you about here in a moment. So at this point, I think we have pretty good coverage across the northern part of North America. Now, that isn't much when you think about the planet, but if you compare it to what existed before, which was just individual studies in individual cities on individual species, it really is a very large leap forward. This is where our partners are located now at this moment. We actually do have one, as you can see, in South Africa and a couple in Germany, and then quite a few across the United States and Canada, but we really are looking to expand this map. Ultimately, we won't really be able to understand urban wildlife globally until we have data that is global. So what does global data allow us to do that we couldn't do before? Just if we think scientifically, so the local value, if you do a study on urban wildlife in your own community, in your own city, you might be able to answer a question like, why don't I see gray foxes on my street anymore, right? These are questions that are important locally, but they don't get us at these broader phenomenon. If you ask questions across the scale of, let's say, a nation, a good-sized nation will say, you might be able to answer questions like, why do we have different populations of medium-sized carnivores across these two cities? What is it about these two cities that leads to different populations of this animal or that animal? But once we can get to global, once we can get up to that scale, we can answer questions that are a little more forward thinking. Things like, how would we design cities to better support carnivores, if that's something that we want to do? Probably don't want every carnivore species in our cities, but some of them maybe could have a place in and around humans. So we need to scale up our studies. We need to go beyond just looking at doing research in our own backyards if we want to create a blueprint that will guide us towards wildlife-friendly cities. We have been now, as a network, as UN, we've been collecting data for several years now. It's starting to really become a truly impressive data set, I think, that can attack questions that were not possible before. It's, I would say, easily the largest urban wildlife data set anywhere in the world, with all of us working together. We can start to do some kind of fun things with the data. For example, across the US and Canada, we can look to see which species we detect most frequently. As you can see on this graph, it is the raccoon. They are at the top of the graph because they are always the winners, it seems like, across the northern part of North America. There are always a ton of raccoons. They are very smart. They are very good at being urban, and they have a lot to teach us about urban adaptation. But what we can really do, using really complicated statistics that you should all feel fortunate that I'm not going to try to share with you today, we can look individually, species by species, and say, what is it that makes this animal do well in this city and not that city? Why is it that this animal is disappearing? Why is this one thriving? Because we have data from across so many cities, we really can start to fundamentally understand what creates the winners and losers, and what we could do differently with our cities to maybe help protect some of the species that might need help. We can even answer questions about things like COVID, right? People keep asking me, well, humans changed their behavior during COVID. Did the wildlife notice? Did they change their behavior? Probably they did. We're still sort of crunching those numbers, analyzing those data, but we have the data. We have data from before, during, and after COVID that we can analyze to understand how things have changed. And it's important to do that because some of the news stories you might be seeing about wildlife during COVID are actually fake. I don't know why people are making up fairy stories about animals during COVID, but people are. So we will be able to use our data to really fundamentally understand scientifically what happened during COVID with the wildlife communities. In Chicago, we also make sure our data are useful for managers and for people who really work with wildlife every day. Recently, we wrote this plan called the Chicago Wildlife Management and Coexistence Plan with the Animal Care and Control Department. This is the plan that animal control officers, if they are called to go to someone's house to respond to some kind of wildlife conflict, this is what they're using to decide what to do. And it's exciting to think that our data are a big part of it. And we want this plan to be something that other cities could pick up and make changes to and perhaps use in their own city because it represents our philosophy and the data that we've collected over all these years. And we already have some evidence that it seems to be working. Some people have said that it has reduced the rates of conflict that are reported in the city, which is, if it's true, that's very cool. We're not just trying to do research for scientists. We're trying to do research that everyone can benefit from. To that end, even though I am a scientist, often I spend a lot of time talking with planners, policymakers, architects, city council members to talk about how can wildlife have a bigger part to play when we talk about how we build cities like Chicago or like Mexico City. How can we give animals a seat at that table? We actually had a big summit about this in 2019. We brought people from all across the network to the zoo in Chicago to talk about what would it look like to create a blueprint for wildlife-friendly cities? What is that process going to entail, and how can we get there? It was really a pretty cool summit. I think we're probably going to repeat it here in a few years with more global, more international partners, hopefully from Mexico and other places, to really think about this at a global scale. What is the role of cities in helping prevent our biodiversity crisis? Because we are a network, we also network together on things that aren't science. So when we do education, when we do outreach, when we reach out to the public to talk about wildlife, if one of us has an idea about how to do that, we can all come together and either make it better or use it in our own cities. On the left side of this graph, you're seeing the same educational program delivered in Chicago on the top, Iowa City in the middle, and Austin, Texas on the bottom. And I would love to see these kinds of efforts also replicated globally. We're especially interested in the US in thinking about issues of equity as well. So we study wildlife and we study them in urban neighborhoods. Well, not every neighborhood has access to the same wildlife. And we know that some communities really have been asked to take on the burden of wildlife conflict, while others really benefit from living near these sort of pristine wildlife habitats. And these, of course, these benefits and costs are not distributed equitably, but we have the data to look into this, to address it and say, what are different communities facing with their wildlife? How have things like racism really shaped people's reactions with wildlife across cities like Chicago? And what can we do to make recommendations to create a more equitable system of interactions with wildlife? So just to give you a little bit of a sense of some of the next steps for this network that we've been building, the big one, I've already been talking to you about it, is to make this network global. That's part of why I'm talking to you today. We know that if we're only working in the United States and Canada, we only have this much idea of what happens with people and wildlife in cities. We have to go beyond that. That's why we've been speaking with some of the people on this call about expanding to Mexico. Really, any city in Mexico would be great, but we've been talking about Mexico City, which I think would be amazing. But we're also talking with people across Europe, across Africa, across South America. I hope in 5 or 10 years' time, this network will truly be global. I'm particularly excited about Mexico City because it would be a nice first step to say we have North America pretty well covered. Now, one city in Mexico is not going to do that, but I hope it's the place to start, and then other researchers across the country will see the benefit of what we're doing and want to join us as well. Obviously, I don't need to talk to, some of you are in Mexico, some are not, but I think probably you're all aware there's amazing biodiversity there that we are not capturing just working in the United States and Canada. Also captures the diversity of climates, right? As we start to move south, the climate changes. That will be very different for wildlife. I'm interested in that as well. And then just in the conversations that I've had with people at UNAM, it just seems like there's such a massive team of researchers doing such incredible work that I get very excited about the idea of connecting our network with them moving forward. So that gives you a very quick bird's eye overview of the network, what we're doing. I'm excited to talk to you more about it and answer your questions and have a roundtable discussion about the work we're doing and how we want to grow it, maybe what it is doing well, what it's not doing well. But yeah, I'm not sure at this point. I think I'm going to pass it over to Colleen, who's going to tell you about some of their really exciting, innovative work. But yeah, thank you so much. So I will stop sharing, I think. But there's our Twitter. If you're interested in what we're doing, there's how you can follow us on Twitter, and there's our website.
Thank you very much, Seth. It was a fantastic, quick, and very didactic and enthusiastic presentation. Now, of course, the realities in the different countries include not only differences in biodiversity, but also in culture. So the way the people in Canada perceive nature and relate to nature is not necessarily the same as in the US, and certainly not the same as in Mexico. And I think it will be fantastic to learn about what Professor Sinclair is going to tell us. So Colleen, please.
All right. Thank you very much, Constantino. And thank you, Seth. That was a wonderful presentation. I'll start by sharing my screen here. And I'll just check with you. Can you see that all right? Awesome.
Yes.
Thanks, Seth. All right. Well, what I'll try to talk to you about in the next few minutes is a little bit of a travelogue through my research background studying urbanizing wildlife with an emphasis on conflict and coexistence, how I came to that. Uh-oh, I've got auto advance on. I'm sorry, I don't know how I turned that on, but I will turn it off. So my training as a graduate student was in behavioral ecology. And in that time, I worked in very remote places like subantarctic seabird islands. And when I began my job as a professor, I wanted to move more explicitly into conservation biology. And I chose to do that by studying how animals move through fragmented habitats, fragmented by any human activities. I did that first with an emphasis on transportation networks in pretty remote places like Canada's national parks. But gradually over time, I've become more and more interested in exactly how animals do this, coexist with people in human-dominated landscapes, especially the most dominated landscapes, urban areas. So over this last 22 years, 24 years, I guess, gosh, I'm getting long in the tooth. I've studied all kinds of urban type issues. Here's just a little example of that diversity, studying corridors and barriers to movement, but also effects of non sort of spatially explicit things like noise pollution, direct forms of impact like vehicle mortality, and indirect forms like food conditioning. If you want to know more about these, you could do so on Google Scholar, probably would be the easiest way. But what I'll talk about today is a particular gradient of coexistence with wildlife that I like to think of along this schematic that was developed by McKinney about 20 years ago, who suggested that among biodiversity, we have species, as Seth acknowledged, that do really quite poorly in combination with urban areas, like maybe an ovenbird, a species widely distributed in North America, but quite avoidant of urban areas. Through species that could be called adapters, chickadees and their relatives across many species, tits in Europe, are great examples of species that manage to do pretty well in urban areas, but they don't become problems or hyperabundant. Through to exploiters, the species that are so good at living in urban areas that they become really hyperabundant there and actually outcompete other species and change a lot of ecological functions. And house sparrows in North America, as well as Mexico, are a good example of that. But really, this schematic that has been used to describe birds applies probably to all biodiversity and including mammals. So I find it really helpful to think about the avoiders versus adapters and exploiters in this context of how to foster coexistence with urban animals that does not slide all the way into conflict. So a lot of my career has been devoted to that. And something I noticed early on working on the way animals move through fragmented habitats is that if they are an adapter or an exploiter, if they have that behavioral capability, and they are also a carnivore, or they're large, or they're considered to be a pest, then almost immediately human-wildlife conflict occurs. So there's this kind of catch-22, or this paradox for urban biodiversity, that the very features that make them able to coexist with people become this source of conflict that makes people not want to have them around. How can we solve that? I think a really key ingredient to that is to study and understand and then manipulate this behavioral commodity of flexibility. You can think of flexibility as something that occurs between species. Everybody's familiar with a hyper-specialist species like pandas that live only in bamboo forests and eat only bamboo, through to very generalist species, another member of the bear family, black bears, that can live almost anywhere, eat almost anything. And if we think about this commodity of flexibility, it applies not only among species, but it could also be described at all the levels of biological organization, and within species describes differences between individuals that might have to do with their life stages, their sensory perceptions, their motor responses, and so on. So within individuals, the study of flexibility typically takes the form of some aspect of personality or temperament. And across a continuum of flexibility, animals might be described as producers versus scroungers, animals that have fast versus slow life history, animals that are bold versus shy, or proactive versus reactive, or explorers versus exploiters. And on each of these continua, I guess I should say, the bolder end, the faster end, tends to be associated with more conflict. So a question becomes, when one's interested in coexistence, can that be changed as a feature? Is it the case that individuals are necessarily prone to conflict? Much of the human-wildlife conflict literature identifies problem individuals. Are those individuals inherently problematic, or have they learned to be problematic as humans perceive them? And could that behavior be changed? I'm especially interested in that aspect of human-wildlife coexistence, with a thesis that behavior is underused as a commodity that determines this conflict versus coexistence. And because behavior is largely voluntary by individuals, it's much more malleable than other characteristics. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I've been studying this with several students over many years, using a tool known as aversive conditioning. And aversive conditioning is just a kind of technical way of saying a particular kind of associative learning that is used to teach animals via experience and their perception some more appropriate behavior that will increase coexistence. And it does that in a particular way. Instead of rewarding animals for behavior, it seeks to punish them for undesired behavior to increase coexistence, capitalizing on capacities to learn, which all animals exhibit. So psychologists would call aversive conditioning positive punishment. Positive because a stimulus is added, and punishment because it's a stimulus the animal does not want. It's closely related as a concept to the idea of hazing, which has become quite prevalent in the management of wildlife, including in urban areas. But it's a little different. Hazing is a little different because it just refers to a very short-term action, whereas aversive conditioning is intended to teach an animal over time behaviors that are more supportive of coexistence. So what I've suggested in a few locations is that we could use punishment of animals. It sounds nasty, but it's actually an alternative to lethal management, this behavior-based management. We could use it more effectively if we better acknowledge the principles of learning theory that support associative learning. I'll give you just a couple of quick examples of this. One is the evolutionary relevance of what we're trying to teach animals. So decades ago, learning theorists showed that animals, rats in particular, readily learn to associate a taste with nausea, and they can associate a sound with shock, but they really can't cross those pathways. And indeed, why would they? Nothing in the evolutionary history of an animal teaches it that taste can cause some kind of physical pain. So there's no capacity for animals to learn that. And yet, that is exactly what wildlife managers are frequently doing when they catch animals at the site of some attractant like garbage. They catch it in the case of a bear in a culvert trap. They take it away to some more remote location. And as the animal's released, they make a bunch of noise, they shoot the animal with rubber bullets, and they otherwise treat it so aggressively that the animal is supposed to learn to fear humans. But what it absolutely can't learn from that is to avoid this distant location where it received a very positive reward. So we could do this in a more effective way if we treated animals that are eating a particular kind of food that puts them in conflict, like apples. If we treated that food with a substance that makes animals nauseated, an emetic, that should teach them to avoid that food. Similarly, if we're going to teach animals they shouldn't trust humans and they shouldn't get close to areas where humans are occurring, we might subject them to some stimulus they don't like, being shot with a slingshot in this case, with a warning like a whistle or some other unique sound that teaches them that's about to happen, that could equip people to use the learned stimulus, the whistle, to have animals move away from them and avoid conflict. So a species that this kind of approach might be applied to is coyotes. Coyotes are becoming infamous throughout North America and now South America. They've recently crossed into South America. And they probably evolved in the arid southwest of the United States and northern Mexico, but they've since expanded their range over many decades, centuries even, to almost all parts of North America and inhabiting almost all cities in North America. And this range expansion is associated with a lot of conflict. And so that's the reason that I chose to study urban coyotes starting about a little over 10 years ago now, with the goal of trying to understand the sources of conflict and then mitigate them and improve opportunities for coexistence. So a whole bunch of students have helped with this too, in addition to a couple of long-term collaborators. And what we've tried to do is determine how three particular areas, habitat selection and movement, diet, and animal condition, relate to conflict, and then identify some unique ways that they might be mitigated. And some of these are kind of obvious ones, but others are rather new. So the first thing we noticed is that humans really underestimate the things that attract wildlife, generally coyotes in particular. Few people realize, for example, that coyotes eat a lot of compost. They eat a lot of birdseed. In fact, we find birdseed in the scats of coyotes about a third of the time at the interface between residential areas and natural areas. They will jump over high fences like this one to eat fruit, even by climbing in or jumping up to eat fruit from fruit trees. Of course, they're attracted to garbage of every kind and pet food, especially pet food that's left in fairly remote areas for animals like feral cats. So a lot of human education is needed on that front, but conditioning the animals can also play a role. And if we were to return to those evolutionary principles, those learning principles that I mentioned, one of the really effective ways to condition animals away from places of attraction at small scales is to use some of these modern types of deterrents that are triggered by the arrival of the animal themselves. Another principle that needs to be addressed, especially for urban coyotes, is to maintain more consistency of consequences. So hazing has become a very prevalent technique for urban coyotes, but it has to outweigh the very frequent access coyotes have to attractants, which of course is a very positive reward. So how can we make this negative positive, this negative stimulus, positive punishment, how can we make that more prevalent? One way would be to engage citizens in this practice with stimuli that still have enough evolutionary relevance to be frightful to coyotes. So in Edmonton, we've been training volunteers organized at the level of neighborhoods to chase coyotes while shouting at them, making noise, and throwing tennis balls in their direction. Tennis balls that have been weighted with sand to make them easier to throw accurately and tied with flagging tape, emulating fladry, a very ancient technique for frightening carnivores. So we're trying to do this to increase coexistence. At the same time, we're trying to understand which species need more help and which species are becoming problematic in our city and other cities. So we were very delighted to join the UN network that Seth just told you about. I'm so impressed with this collaborative team of people. There are so many young, vibrant, creative people involved in this network. Seth is one of them, but there are dozens across the continent and now emerging around the world. And this organization has already produced some tremendous work with a bunch more things in progress. So we played a small role by adding our city to the network and becoming a collaborator. We followed the standardized design of placing remote cameras across a gradient of urbanization with logistical support from the network. We gathered images from these cameras and we processed them to determine what species were occurring. So this is an image of Edmonton, the city I live in. This is the center of the city, and we arranged these cameras in kind of concentric circles of lesser urbanization. But we were also interested in monitoring some aspects of corridor use by these animals. This is a river valley that runs through Edmonton that contains a very large contiguous area of natural habitat. We wanted to know how dependent animals were on that. We also wanted to know how well the city's existing management for biodiversity was working in relation to some metrics they've developed. So let me give you a sense of the kind of species we found. Species that are known to occur in cities, including ours, but sometimes surprisingly so, like deer, both species of whitetail and mule deer. We found moose at a lot of sites, including a lot of sites that were much more urban than we expected to find moose at. Coyotes were abundant in all kinds of sites. I'll show you that numerically in a moment. And they often were found in association with other species that we're investigating a bit now. Magpies are particularly dependent on coyotes. We found foxes, but not often overlapping with coyotes, which are very aggressive towards coyotes. And we found some species that have only recently arrived in Edmonton in any numbers, including badgers, fishers, a large member of the mustelid weasel family, cougar, lynx, and raccoons. Now, Seth said that raccoons are the most abundant species in the UN network as a whole, but they're very new to Edmonton. They occurred here periodically over many years, but it seems that it's right now that they are establishing a breeding population. So it'll be interesting times ahead for us. I started to acknowledge that one of the things we wanted to do was determine how well the city's existing tools were predicting biodiversity. The city has invested a lot of effort in developing some indices of biodiversity potential, having to do with the size, shape, and diversity of habitats. And they've also got an index called ecological connectivity, which has to do with proximity to habitat reserves, particularly this very large river valley that I mentioned. And so we wanted to know how well our camera data aligned with the predictions of these two indices. We did that by comparing all the mammals that we detected in 3 different design groups that the city has designated for mammals, ranging from large to medium to small. I'm showing you here an example of the medium mammals. So these are the mammals that we found in Edmonton on a log scale. And showing you here that coyotes were the most abundant medium-sized mammal and also mammal generally, and that there was a tremendous gradient of detection rates for these animals. And then what we did was try to model their occurrence in a presence and an absence way, as well as their relative abundance measured by visitation frequency on these cameras against the kinds of metrics that are being used to design these indices of biodiversity potential and ecological connectivity, but also some things that we didn't know before that we can detect because of the urban cameras. So an example that I'll show you in this graph is that as a group, these medium, this stands for ecological design group, mammals are occurring more often, that's what the positive side of this coefficient means, where there are also domestic dogs. So as one example of our findings, we're going to drill down a little bit more in that and try to understand why that's the case. Is it because the dogs are attracted to the mammals as just interesting sense? Is it because people are attracted to urban areas with more biodiversity and so on? So what I've tried to give you a sense of in this few minutes is an idea of how we are going about integrating behavioral ecology, the behavior of animals in natural and urbanizing environments, with the need for conservation of these animals, acknowledging that an older view of conservation was to just try to increase the prevalence of biodiversity, especially in areas that are changed by human activity. But increasingly, we know as a community of scientists and society that we need to do that in a way that supports coexistence with people. And that's going to involve a lot of behavioral learning by people and wildlife. So I'll end there by just thanking some of the organizations that funded our work over the years. I want to especially acknowledge all these grad students that have been really great to work with, collaborators of many sorts, volunteers, government employees, and many, many members of communities. And like Seth, I'd be very happy to take questions if you have any.
Thank you very much, Colleen. It was a fantastic example of the things that we can learn through collecting information, but also guiding the collection of information with relevant hypotheses, in particular your hypothesis coming from behavioral ecology. And I find I haven't seen yet questions so from the public. So I if I may, I will make a few comments. So I find very interesting that both you and Seth touched on the need to feedback on policy making. So it is necessary to educate the people on how to behave towards animals, as well as animals to how to avoid how to reduce the conflict, but also to generate policies. And that is perhaps one of the things in which Mexico is not as advanced yet as some areas of Canada or of the US. Although there is this connection between policy making and academia, it is less developed, and there is still the case that parks and wild areas are visited in Mexico to play football, whilst what we call football, which is soccer, and listen at your music for dancing. Whereas here, for instance, in Canada, when I moved, I noticed how much people is attracted to Le Parc de la Gatineau. And when I went there, I saw a bear. Second time I walked there. So it is a different way of approaching that has to do with education of the people. But also, as Seth mentioned, I think that's a very, very important point. Education is not homogeneously distributed, even in the wealthy cities of North America. And it takes an effort to understand how differences in education and differences in income translate into differences in how much you can enjoy the urban wildlife, or how much you can have a conflict with urban wildlife. So I find absolutely fascinating how the two talks interlink and the need for doing this research. And I got a question from Alberto Fonserrada, whom you saw at the beginning of the of the just before the talk is our link with UNAM Chicago, and he says that well, you can read probably in the chat. I see, but for the people who are not reading this, I see, for example, squirrels and dogs are less shy to humans because they are used to being fed, even if we are not encouraged to do so. But what about rats? As I walk my dogs in the morning here in Chicago, I find that rats in Chicago, who are booming, by the way, are becoming more and more daring. They don't run when they see you. So it seems that rats don't require that particular encouragement. Could you like to comment on
Yeah,
that?
so I'll say that a researcher that both Colleen and I are very familiar with, Maureen Murray, leads a project called the Chicago Rat Project. We're trying to understand rats in the city, but more importantly, how people face threats from rats in the city. It's amazing to me how little is known, considering that rats have been a problem for cities since the dawn of cities, right? But I think because they're kind of gross, no one really wants to study them. It's not a stigma anyone wants. So, but Maureen is bravely trying to push past that. Yeah, Orkin, the pest control company, they for 8 years in a row now have said that Chicago is America's rattiest city, right? But they don't really know that. What they mean is we do the most business in Chicago. And what that means is people in Chicago are most willing to pay money to get rid of their rats. I can't believe we have more rats than New York City. I just don't think that's possible. But anyway, but that is very interesting because what they're really talking about then is who has the financial resources and the ability to sort of try to do something about their rats. But what Maureen's work is finding, of course, is that many communities have a lot of rats, but they don't want to call the city about it because they don't think the city's going to do anything. They don't have the money to throw at some company like Orkin. So as a result, we have a very skewed view of who is really threatened by rats and what those threats look like. And it's a huge issue, right? I mean, it's one of the major urban wildlife conflicts that exists, but I think a lot of people don't even think of rats as wildlife, though of course they are. So yeah, we're trying to really shine a light on these issues and trying to create some education to let people know that no matter where you live in Chicago, you can call the city. They will probably respond. They will come out and put out traps. But yeah, the deeper issue, like they're eating all the food that we leave out. So how do we secure our trash? How do we make it so that we're not leaving all these resources out for these rats so that they learn to associate them with humans the same way, you know, I think Alberto was asking about, like, yeah, squirrels and ducks. If you feed them, they're going to come up to you. Conflict is going to ensue. That's basically what we've done with rats. We've just done it a little passively by leaving giant piles of garbage where they could get to them.
Yep. Don't know whether you, Colleen, would like to add something, or otherwise I may also want to add something in. So.
Well, I'll add just briefly that this problem of feeding wildlife, I think, is the number one contributor to conflict in cities, and it happens inadvertently as well as intentionally. So Edmonton recently passed a bylaw prohibiting the feeding of wildlife, and one of the things that's driving that appetite, if you will, for prohibitions on feeding wildlife that people might think is quite benign, is a very rapid increase in zoonotic diseases. Zoonotic meaning diseases that animals carry that they can transmit to people. So of course, in this COVID era, nobody needs to be convinced that that's a bad thing. And I think it might be the thing that finally convinces people who are motivated by compassion to feed wildlife in cities, that finally convinces them that that just has to stop. I think that is the number one policy change.
And rats differently because he does look at them differently. But I believe that squirrels, after they reach a particular size of their population, a particular density in a city, are just like rats because they have the same behavioral tools. They can recognize when a member of the group is ill. They can also help each other. They can exploit different sources of food. Even they can prey on wee birds in their nests. And so I think if we stop now feeding squirrels, they will go on as rats without problem. So they are beyond that threshold. They are not that different. And dogs, probably not, because there are not places where they can get food so readily. But I don't think that, for instance, the squirrels would require much more encouragement. I think they have reached already in many cities the threshold level from which they can be regarded as a pest. And in fact, they issue cables. They cause a lot of conflict by issuing cables in the roofs, etc., in many cities. But I would like to move from that to another point that is, I think, also interesting. There is the concept of history. So, Colleen, you just mentioned that there are several species that were not all that abundant, or probably not even seen in Edmonton until recently. I noticed the same in Mexico City with the ringtail, which is probably going to be the equivalent to the raccoon further north. It's a cousin of the raccoon, is extremely able to go about, and is now all over the place in Mexico City, to the point that you find it in areas in the very center of the city where there is no a park or something. So they have managed to learn, I suppose, to get the food for the pets, cat food or dog food. They climb better than the cats. They can avoid, sometimes they fight, but sometimes they avoid conflict with cats. But they were not there a few years ago. And I have the impression that the urbanization in North America has been so explosive that the species that we see as dominant, and the ones that are going to become more evident in UWIN's data at the beginning, are the ones that arrived earlier or managed to get into cities earlier, but that many other species will source out the trick of how to live with humans. Now, for that to happen, we need also to provide some conditions, but also, in order to know that, we have to have this long-term project like UWIN. I think that will tell us whether this hypothesis that I'm just throwing in is correct, and more species will eventually come into the cities. I mean, if we don't change very much the conditions in the process. So what do you think, for instance, Seth?
Yeah, that's really interesting. You know, thinking about those thresholds now, you've got me thinking about other species, and like if there is such a threshold where, you know, they were maybe inflated by some deliberate sort of targeted human behavior, and we take that away. Yeah, it's I think you're probably onto something. I mean, I definitely think you're right that squirrels, you know, in Chicago you have gray squirrels and fox squirrels. I think both species are just fine without any sort of human intervention. We've just created such a connected canopy of tree branches and power lines and stuff that it seems to me that all squirrels really want is to be up above stuff and kind of run around. And we've definitely created that for them in a way that I don't think we can take back. But I think a lot about things like geese, right? I mean, we have so many geese in the city. They're such a massive problem. And I still see people feeding them bread. And I'm just like, what are you doing? We do not need any more geese. They hiss at people. They're very aggressive. They're just very obnoxious birds. And then, of course, we have laws in the US that make it very difficult to do any lethal control of them. So they just sort of run wild. But the other thing about geese I think about they're tundra species, right? And then I look at all of these landscaped manicured parks that we've created for things like football fields, like you said, and others, but where it's just short grass in huge expanses. And I think, well, we built goose habitat. We built massive expanses of goose habitat. So yeah, there's the side that's direct human activity, then there's the side that's sort of planning and policy. I've always been so impressed by, you know, you asked earlier about kind of connections to policy. Part of why I was so excited Colleen was here is that I think of all of the UN partners, I always think of Edmonton as the one that had the tightest pipeline, it seemed like, between the researchers and the city parks folks who really cared what the researchers found. And I have struggled in Chicago to get the people to care what I find. And so I've always wanted to know what Colleen's secret was to kind of make that happen. Because to me, that's what you need to really make progress on that side of the equation. And then the first side is probably education. But yeah, for the policy side.
Colleen?
Well, it's food, of course. I always take pastries to meetings. No, I'm kidding. You just make me realize I should.
I just wrote it down.
There's so many interesting things to think about in that exchange from both of you, but one of the things I found myself thinking about is that we just need to be more proactive and aware and help more people have that understanding. Geese is such a good example, Seth, that remain protected under the Migratory Birds Convention Act, even though they've long been a massive hyperabundant problem. And I think that we also underestimate the way hyperabundance, just really abundant populations, changes the behavior of individuals across species. This is, you know, sort of infamously known in a place like New York, famous for its aggressiveness with a phenomenal density of people. And it's been shown in many other species, you know, virtually all species, that higher densities, conspecific densities of individuals makes individuals bolder. They have to be bolder to outcompete the other individuals. So I think population regulation of some sort is going to be a critical part of the solution. We can't do it all with education and attractant management. And figuring out how to make that acceptable to people, I think, is another one of the really big challenges. And I don't have an answer to provide other than to say a growing proportion of people reject lethal management, killing animals. And the alternative might be to prevent them from being born or hatched in the first place with some sort of contraceptive intervention. That's also very difficult to do technically, and that's also not acceptable to everyone. But somehow, I think we have to realize that we're on a trajectory that is going to get worse, not better. And with big species and carnivorous species, cougar is one that's particularly problematic. Unfortunately, I think it will require the reaching of a threshold of deaths of children in particular before this sort of light bulb will come on, and people will agree that there has to be regulatory framework around attracting animals into urban areas.
This is very interesting, Colleen, and I'm going to make a comment about it, but also I would like to say that to ask you first if birds are going to, I mean, feeding birds is also being banned. You know, we feed birds. I put a feeder at home the other day. It was squirrel proof, but it was not raccoon proof. And the raccoon opened it. I have the pictures today from the raccoon coming to open it. And so it managed to open it. And I don't see the Western society moving away from feeding birds in the gardens, but that immediately creates opportunities for raccoons and others, probably in Mexico for cacomistles or these ringtails. And there I see the problem that you mentioned, because we are many. We are going to keep doing things. We are going to be accumulating food in the cities, thereby breaking the link between the resources and the population size. I mean, there is no longer a feedback between the abundance of food and the size of the populations. That is going to be broken, and we have to do things about it. In the South, so to speak, in the less developed countries or the less rich societies, there's no problem with cougar or puma because people kill it. Then societies become more rich, want to enjoy nature, and then there is a conflict. And finding the balance is going to take the sociologist to come to give us a hand, to lend us a hand. How do we move in that direction? Because we expect societies are going to become increasingly wealthy. We hope that, we expect that, and we strive to that, and we are going to generate then these conflicts.
I have some ideas, but I think it's, Seth, I think it's your turn. Do you want to take that first?
Why don't you go first, Colleen? I think you'll probably have more cogent thoughts than I do.
Well, I have been giving this one a lot of thought because there's an adage now in conservation biology that all conservation biologists become poorly trained social scientists. So I've been trying to work with social scientists in all of my projects because I really believe it, the thing you just said, Constantino, that it is essential to success in this realm of coexistence. And they are teaching me about a particular tool that I think has a lot of promise. It's modeling around risk based on the perceptions of people. So instead of wildlife managers sort of decreeing that you have this risk or that risk, it's kind of a more combined approach to use some education, yes, but also to really listen to, via social science surveys, to the views of the people and understand what they perceive to be the undesirable outcomes, and then use that as kind of the springboard for the management interventions that speak directly to those risks and create, ideally, more of a consensus about what needs to be done and how it ought to be done. And I think it's a long, messy process, as everything with humans is, but I really like it as a philosophical approach, and I'm trying to use it in all my projects now.
Good, good. Seth?
Yes, it's interesting because I dipped my toe into social science as an undergraduate, and I thought I would leave that behind. And now as Colleen said, I lean so heavily on that. I speak with all of these, as I said, policymakers and even architects and planners, and their terminology is completely different. I always feel very stupid when I talk to them because I don't understand, but I get a little better every time. It is hard when you work in this field that's at the intersection of so many things. You sort of become this generalist. To be honest, that's part of my motivation in bringing together the network, was that I sort of realized that I was no longer enough of a specialist in any particular field, that I was going to really greatly push it forward. But I thought I had the general skills to bring together a lot of smart people and kind of let them do their thing. And maybe I could provide the umbrella that would kind of move that research broadly in one direction. So yes, work a lot with social scientists these days. I'm on several grants that sort of involve this intersection of social and natural scientists. And I find it very interesting to tie back to some of our earlier topics, thinking about human behavior change, right? How do you really inspire behavior change? Because of course we know it's not fact-based, right? It's not, we can't come to the public and say, hey, it's bad if you feed birds, you should stop. That's not going to work on anyone. It has to have some kind of an emotional appeal. There needs to be a story behind it. And those are things that scientists are very bad at. So when you want to take your research from theoretical to practical, it's very complicated. It's very hard, and I'm still working on it, but I think it's so important because I didn't get into this field just because I thought it was interesting theoretically. It was because I saw a need to make change, and so that's kind of the transformation that I'm trying to go through in my career in a slow way.
Yeah, so here we have these like three different ways of coming to this. I was attracted to the urban animal biology because they were there, basically, and I was doing animal behavior and needed topics for third year projects for my students, and eventually got involved in this, the problem of noise, which we have only skimmed through. We have not mentioned the problem of light. Of course, the pollutions that are part of the challenges in the cities. And one that we found in Mexico was also the creative, loosely use the word creative use of rubbish by birds, which are using some rubbish to reduce the risk of having ectoparasites. They use the cigarette butts to line the nests. And by doing that, they reduce the amount of ectoparasites that they get in the nest. And we even demonstrated eventually that it is in part a response to the amount of parasites in the nest. And it has consequences that are beneficial to the chicks in that they can produce heavier chicks, heavier fledglings, but also they get some level of toxicity that we still don't know whether it will have long-term consequences because they have short lives anyway. So this is a circumstance in which, although this is not precisely evolution, this is a type of adaptation, behavioral adaptation, plastic adaptation to cities that probably is going to change as cities become more clean, in the sense that there are fewer and fewer smokers. Of course, this is going to be substituted with I don't know what. But there are still very many cities in the world that where smoking is very popular, and birds can collect the cigarette butts and do that. And so this thing of the rubbish that attracts animals, but also can have other consequences, could be a completely extra topic to go through. It also has consequences for what we see in the cities and in which numbers. But I don't think we can go into that because time. I think we already passed the time we were allotted. But I am hesitant to stop because I am enjoying very much this interaction of with you. So could you have any particular message to the very diverse audience that is out there listening? I mean, it's people from university linked in many different ways, but certainly from different areas.
Well,
So,
I'll close by saying that I think that, in my view, the way that science advances is by diversifying, and that's been the story of my career. I'm trying to diversify the different cities that I sample, but also the different specialties there. And as you pointed out right towards the beginning, that means not just capturing a diversity of ecological relationships, but cultural relationships, economic relationships, because all of those feed into this urban system. So my guess is that everyone who might be listening to this probably has something they can contribute to the kind of work that we're doing, because it's just that far reaching. So I hope people are kind of listening and are interested in being some kind of part of this network or networks like it, because I think that it's incredibly important that we reach out as broad a net as we can to really get everybody's seat at the table.
thank you, Seth. Colleen?
Yeah, I'll just say really briefly, we didn't get to the loon question in the chat, so I'll say loons are among the real avoiders. And if anyone has figured out how to get loons to be more tolerant of people, that's a great thing as I see it. But I want to echo what Seth said, that I know there's a lot of expertise out there and the people we can't see, and just welcome anybody who would like to reach out to me by email, cstclair@ualberta.ca. And thanks for what I learned today from you, Constantino, and also you, Seth.
Well, thank you very much to the two of you. It was fantastic. And I, of course, want to keep in touch with you. Now I am in Canada, so I can keep in touch, I hope, with you, Colleen, and Seth. I hope we will soon be another dot in Irwin. I only have to say, which I say it in English and then in Spanish, that there will be the next talk in Diálogos del Bicentenario. It will be in November 23rd at the same time, 12 p.m. Mexico City time, and there will be Dr. Estefanía Cruz Lera from CISAN, and also Dr. Paz Consuelo Marquez Padilla, also from CISAN, and they will be talking about justice and democracy, a most important topic. So I hope you can join us. And again, thank you very much, Seth and Colleen. It was fantastic, and I learned a lot.
Thanks in turn.
Thank you so much.
Bye.